Okay, good afternoon. I'm Kelly Clifton, a professor of civil engineering, and I'm an instructor for this class, but today I'm also the presenter, so I'm introducing myself today. I want to thank you all for coming. I know sunshine is a hard competition. It's a beautiful day outside, so hopefully you can get out after this and enjoy the day. So first thing I want to say is that we're passing around the attendance sheet. If you don't see your name, it might be on the other side, so just flip it over. So what I want to talk about today is some more theoretical content. So it's not going to be a study with empirical evidence. It's not even a study. It represents some of my thinking about transportation. And it brings together two aspects of transportation that I've spent a lot of my career working in. So the first part has to do with thinking about transport disadvantaged and how we can better address their unmet needs through policy or through the provision of infrastructure, and how our current methodologies really do a poor job of capturing what those unmet needs are. And then the second piece of this has to do with transportation demand modeling and thinking about how we forecast and try to predict into the future what the demand for transportation is going to be. And so if you've been paying at all attention to transportation in the last year or two, you know that our alternatives are changing really rapidly. The technology is changing really rapidly. We're talking about autonomous vehicles. We're talking about drones. We're talking about a lot of modes that we really don't have any experience with. And so our current modeling techniques are perhaps ill-prepared to help us think about how to predict use of these modes in the future. And so I am going to talk today about latent demand, which I think is a way to kind of reconcile these two aspects of my work. So we often hear, build it and they will come. And so we talk about that on sort of in two different ways. So transportation advocates often say that there is a pent-up or suppressed demand for biking and walking, and that if we just provide these facilities, that people will use them. On the other side of the coin, those same advocates often argue that we can't continue to expand capacity in our roadway because as we continue to build it, it will just increase demand over time. And so the idea is that there's some pent-up or unmet need that's going to be activated by transportation improvements or actually any changes in culture or technology or society. And so if you look at the literature on latent demand, or sometimes called induced demand, it focuses on traveler responses to changes in travel costs. So if we widen a road or adjust signal timing so that the travel times go down, we want to know how much are people going to rearrange and readjust their travel modes or travel times or travel routes to adjust to this change in travel costs. But there's sort of missing from these papers are several things, but the biggest thing is any sort of discussion of underlying foundations of where demand comes from and what would be the behavioral foundations of this latent demand, and is it infinite? So if we just drop the travel costs to zero, will we be traveling all the time? Probably not. So a better understanding or a better framework for helping us think about this, I think, is needed. And so this would help us, again, if we circle back to my interest, to think about better forecasting. What might the consequences be for people who can't travel, who have some unmet needs, and help us to think about where that is and how might we respond, and where are the unmet needs for transportation have to do with transportation itself, and where does this pent-up demand have to do with other things like poverty. So the demand for transportation is all about moving people and moving goods. But we talk about it as being a derived demand. So who wants to tell me what that means? Come on. Don't make me do all the talking. I know you guys know. What does it mean that transportation demand is derived?
means that people are not traveling for the joy of traveling. They're traveling to accomplish other tasks and other wants and desires.
That's right. So Patrick might tell you otherwise, because he's looking at sort of the joy of traveling in his dissertation. But in general, when we're traveling not for recreation or not for joyrides, we are traveling to get somewhere to do something, right? And it's the thing that we want to do that's motivating our travel. So we're consuming transportation services not because we want transportation services, but we are trying to satisfy our needs, or we're trying to distribute goods. And so latent demand, when we use this in a transportation context, we talk about currently desired demand that we can't realize because we have some constraint. And there's a couple ways to think about this unmet demand. And so the first way is talking about redistributed demand. So this is the one that is most often talked about when we talk about how road improvements or how transportation improvements will release this pent-up demand. And so there's some amount of demand that we have, and we just rearrange that demand either across modes or across times or across destinations based on what the travel costs are, the easiest way to get there is. So we're just moving demand around, moving the same amount of demand. It's being realized in different ways. And this is basically how our travel demand models work. So when we are doing long-range forecasting, we're estimating a certain amount of demand and some relationships to key factors like costs and income and so on. And we're projecting that into the future. And we're saying, well, how will this demand for activities and demand for transportation be rearranged based on how the city and activities and transportation is structured? There's another way to think about latent demand, which is called generative demand. And these are suppressed trips. So they're not demand that we can actually see and measure, but actually trips that we're not making or activities that we're not pursuing. And so those trips and those activities can be activated also due to the transportation system, but they could also be activated due to some exogenous force. So there's some new technological change, like autonomous vehicles. And so we might find ourselves doing things or making trips in ways that we weren't before. That's brand new. It's growth in demand. Another way to think about this, if you were at Christy Curran's talk last week, she gave this timeline of like when different things happened over time, and she talked about like when the ATMs came into being, or when we could do point of sale, or when email happened. And so until those technological changes happened, we weren't conducting our shopping activities online. We were making a trip for that. So that we may have had suppressed trips because whatever it is we weren't able to do it before. And so it's this generative demand that I'm most interested in. So our current demand models are estimated using what we call observed travel or revealed preferences. And so we tend to have people fill out a travel diary, or we measure their trips using GPS, and that is how we're evaluating demand. But what about the trips that we're not making? So if you are poor and the bus isn't meeting your needs, if you work the night shift and you need to do something, you need to go to the grocery store when you get off work at 4 a.m., and the bus isn't serving your needs, then you might have trips that you don't make. Or if you don't have money, you might not be able to make that trip to the doctor. So we don't evaluate the total demand for activities. We only evaluate what this positive end of the spectrum. And so if that's the only thing we're modeling and the only thing we're capturing, we actually don't have any ability to see how our transportation policies and improvement could move something from the negative side to the positive side of the scale. And so here's how this might be articulated in an example. So this might be what we actually observed in a travel diary. So somebody said that they started their day at home, they drove to work. At lunchtime, they walked to this pizza shop, and then they walked back to work. Then they drove to school to pick up their children. They drove home, and then they walked the dog. And so that's what the travel diary said that they did. However, at the beginning of the day, they may have actually planned to do one other thing, which is making a trip to the supermarket on the way home after picking up their kids at school. But for a variety of reasons, perhaps they didn't. They were running late. Congestion didn't give them enough time. The dog is waiting on them at home. All you dog owners know you have to get home to take care of your dog. So we don't even know that this was on the agenda or something that they planned to do. And so what might happen on the next day is that this trip actually gets accomplished. So somebody else is walking the dog maybe, and so they went to the supermarket and they did this other thing. But this is just what's planned. So there's a lot of problems with the way we collect transportation data, and part of that reason, one of those problems, is we often only collect one day of data. So we actually don't capture then the full complement of things. We don't know if the supermarket trip was planned in the first place, and then we never actually capture it, that trip being made, because we only capture one day of travel. So in thinking about this problem, what I wanted to do is start thinking about these unmet activities, and starting mostly with an equity lens, but moving on to travel demand modeling lens. And so thinking about activities, because that's what the travel is derived from. And why do I want to do this? Well, again, I think that if we have a better definition of latent demand, and we, at the end of the day, at some point, I don't have this answer yet, but we have some ability to quantify latent demand, then we have a better gauge of the true impact of our transportation investments. We can start to understand other things that are going to affect travel demand besides transportation investments. So changes in society and in the social norms, changes in technology, changes in our culture and the economy. So things that aren't about transportation investments, but they have an impact on levels of congestion, for example. It can help us understand more about inequities in the system and whose needs are being satisfied, what the consequence of this is. So asking people how satisfied were they, maybe they got to make the trip, but were they able to do the things that they needed to do? And again, to sort out what kinds of problems can we address through transportation policy, and what kinds of things are about other kinds of social programs and social policies. And so this is my first attempt to sort of think about some theoretical framework for us to think about this. So there won't be any models. There won't be any modeling results to talk about. Okay, so the first thing that I started to do is start to look at the literature on latent demand. And so this is a concept that comes from economics, but other disciplines think about latent demand in slightly different ways. And I think they're useful for us in transportation to maybe start incorporating those into our ideas and our theory. So this just comes from Wikipedia. Don't reference that in a paper you're writing for me, but I am going to use it in a talk. So induced demand or latent demand is the phenomenon that after some supply increases, we're consuming more of a good. So this is a traditional economic way of thinking about latent demand. But this is a maybe broader concept of latent demand that captures some equity considerations. So demand for a product or service that the consumer cannot satisfy because they don't have enough money, or because the product or service is not available, or because they don't know it's available. So some sort of market failure, why people aren't, why there's this latent demand. Now, then when you start looking at marketing very closely, they're very good at capturing our latent demand. So here they're thinking that you didn't even know you wanted an iPhone, or you didn't even know you wanted those pair of shoes, but they're going to convince you that you need that and you want it. So they're trying to activate demand that you weren't even aware of. So this concept is that it's basically a desire for some product or service that you can't satisfy because you can't even articulate that you have this demand, or you're not even aware of it. So it's somewhat intangible to you. And so if you don't know this thing exists, or you don't know how to use the transit service, or you're not aware of a route that would serve your needs, then you don't even have a demand for it because you're not conscious of it. You're not aware. And then this is sort of following on the same idea. The concept of latent demand pertains to those who have an interest in doing something but haven't translated yet that interest into some action. So this is a little bit different than the previous one. This one, you're not aware of something, and they're trying to stimulate awareness and stimulate demand. And here you're very much aware, but you haven't actually taken any action to fulfill that need. So after reviewing the literature and going kind of way back, and I will tell you that if you go back and start reading stuff from the 50s and 60s, it's kind of a treasure trove of new ideas that have never really perpetuated in the literature today. And so some of what I've done here is drawn on a report that was done in 1968 that was thinking about demand for transit in Pittsburgh. And so there's two components here. There could be more, but in my conceptual diagram, we're thinking about two. So the first one has to do with awareness. So are you aware that this is something that you need to do or want to do? And so things below this axis are things that you're not aware of yet. And then the x-axis here has to do with the capabilities of the transportation system or even the land use system to help you fulfill that demand. So this is what we tend to be concerned about as transportation planners and engineers. And this is really on something else. So marketers may have much more of a consciousness about how people are aware of their own needs. So we'll start here. So if we look in this first quadrant, we're above the awareness axis. So people know that they want to do something. They desire to take a trip. But the transportation system isn't accommodating this trip because transportation system's perhaps not capable of doing it. So the route doesn't exist, or it doesn't exist when you need it. So here's some examples of that. Spatial and temporal gaps in transit system. So where people want to go relative to where and when the transit system will serve their needs. Perhaps the travel times in that transit system mean that you can't get there in time to perform the activity. So if you're trying to get to work on time and the bus isn't getting you there and you arrive late, maybe that's unacceptable. Or if you're trying to go to the movies, doesn't get you there till after the movie starts, the activity isn't worthwhile pursuing. Perhaps you don't have access to automobile. So you would like to do more things in the evening when you got home from work, but you don't have a mechanism to do them. Internet access. So we often talk about telecommunications as a substitution for travel. So if you don't have good internet access, you can't buy those shoes online, or you can't communicate with your friend by email or by text. Food desert. So I actually did my dissertation thinking about food desert. So where are there gaps in the land use system? Maybe the transit system serves their needs, but the land use system, it doesn't provide enough accessibility to the kinds of activities people want to do. And then the infrastructure for biking and walking. So again, this is the one that's often used to say if we invest in better biking infrastructure and walking infrastructure, we'll see this demand activated. So if we move over to quadrant 2 here, again, activities are desired, but the transportation system is suitable, but perhaps there are other barriers or other constraints to people making that trip and pursuing that activity. So poverty being the biggest one. So you just don't have the financial resources to go to the movie, perhaps. So you don't go. So that demand, that trip isn't made, that activity is not pursued, but it's not because the transportation system is problematic, it's because you don't have the resources. Maybe you have scheduling conflicts, and so you're too busy because you're doing too many other things. So this is when we talk about people with higher incomes. Often time poverty affects low-income people and high-income people. So I'm just too busy to go to the gym. At least that's the excuse I tell myself every morning. Social exclusion or cultural barrier. So feeling like you don't belong or that this isn't a place where you can go to. It's not for me because of some other barrier. Discrimination. Perhaps when I was doing my dissertation, there was a lot of talk about welfare to work and getting people off of public support and getting them into jobs. And so there was a lot of effort to provide transportation support. But when you look at a lot of those programs, yes, people may have had transportation barriers, but they often had lack of work history to help them be successful in those jobs in the first place. So again, they might not be making those work trips, but not because the transportation system isn't serving their needs. And then here in Portland, you know, and other cities, we're having more and more problems with the rising costs of housing. And so if you have limited choices in where to live, perhaps you have to live in a place where you don't have good access. And so maybe that doesn't exactly fit exactly in this quadrant. It might sort of straddle the two quadrants, because having to live somewhere with poor access can also be a transportation issue. So the stuff at the top of the axis makes kind of sense, right? To you guys, you can all intuitively experience this kind of suppressed demand in your own lives. Oops. When we get down here below the axis, then we're below this awareness. So here, people aren't desiring to do these activities, or they're not aware that it's a possibility, but the transportation system will allow them to do it if only they knew about it. So some examples of this. Today, my parents are in town, and I made them take the bus with me. And they had never taken the bus. They didn't know how to use it, and it wouldn't have occurred to them to take the bus downtown if I hadn't held their hand and put them on the bus with me. So I think this is fairly common. People don't know how to use the bus, and so it's not something that's even on their radar. But it's there, it exists, it might be a perfectly viable alternative for the trip. Maybe I'm not motivated to engage in an activity. Never would occur to me to go to the gym in the first place, or to get out and take a walk. So I like to stay home and watch TV. It's a suppressed demand for an activity, maybe because I just haven't seen the light, like, say, stand-up paddleboarding. Like, maybe I didn't know, and then somebody took me paddleboarding, and now it's like my favorite thing to do. So there was a suppressed demand for something I wasn't even aware was something I'd like to do. Or maybe it's a new restaurant or a new clinic for healthcare, and I just didn't know it was there, so I can't access it. I can't use it if I don't have the information available. And then another example might be someone surprises you and says, hey, I'm going to take you to lunch. Well, you weren't planning on doing that. You hadn't thought about it. It wasn't on your agenda. You weren't aware of it. But the transportation system could accommodate it if someone were to say, come to my office and say, gee, I'd like to buy you lunch. Okay, great. Okay, and then this quadrant is the most difficult one, I think, for us to conceive. So again, this awareness isn't there. We're not desiring it, mostly because it doesn't exist yet. So things that the transportation system can't accommodate, perhaps because we haven't got that far yet. So these things are on the cusp of where we are right now, driverless vehicles. If you were starting to talk, I can't take a driverless vehicle now, although I'm very aware that it exists or is going to exist. But let's say 10 years ago, it wouldn't be on the consciousness of the public that this would be something that we could do or take. Teleportation, can't do that either, so I'm not really thinking about it. I get up, I don't think about teleporting anywhere, very often anyway. Hovercraft or this Hyperloop, these are things that don't exist, and so they're not on people's consciousness. Drone delivery, getting a pizza printed out at my house, right? Or getting those pair of shoes printed out at my house. Can't do that yet, so I'm not thinking about it, and so on. So this is maybe easier to think about if you go back in time and say, okay, all these things that we're doing today, like online shopping, like using our cell phones for all kinds of things, taking Uber, 10, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, some of these things didn't exist. And so they weren't on the consciousness. And we're doing them now and using them now every day and not questioning it. But 30 years ago, no one would have thought about it. So this is basically my framework to think about the different aspects of this generative demand. So how might we activate these things? And the question that I have then been struggling with is, how might we capture this in our data collection efforts? And so how might we be able to say something about those trips that we're not making? So starting here at the top, these are things, again, that are easy for us to wrap our heads around. We experience this every day, and it's easier for us to at least collect that information in a travel survey or some sort of data collection methodology because the traveler is aware that they want to do it. So if you can ask the question in the right way, they can express that unmet need for you to you. We don't often do that, but it's a possibility. It's within our realm of ability to capture it. So again, if we go back to my example about what we planned to do, what we actually did, and then punting it down to the next day when we maybe had more time, we can capture this. We can move beyond this one-day travel diary, or at least I hope we move beyond this one-day travel diary, because it's within our ability to collect this information, a lot of it passively. So getting at this with a travel diary that's multi-day, that asks people what they did and how they got there, and a little bit more about their attitudes and things that they care about and their preferences. And if we add passive data collection, say with a smartphone, to ease the burden of collecting a lot of information, we still might not get at those trips that were never ever made, but we could capture some of that demand that wasn't realized on day one, but was eventually realized on day two. So that only solves part of the problem. It doesn't solve this other problem. So the things that never got done. So in the early 2000s, there was a couple of innovations where they were trying to get at this. So get at what they call activity scheduling process. So when did you first think about doing this activity? When did it become real for you in space and time? And did you actually do it, or did you move it around to another day or another time? And so the two big efforts that were there is Michael McNally did some work in Southern California, and Sean Doherty did some work in Toronto. And so this was a computer-aided survey, and it was very burdensome for the respondent. So basically, they were filling out a calendar. And so, for example, when did you know you were coming class today? Well, probably when you registered for the class, you had it in your calendar in maybe dark pencil. And then the sun came out this afternoon, and maybe you said, I'm going to watch the class online because it's a nice day. So at what point did you make the change to that? And did you ever watch my talk? So this kind of information is like, what did you plan to do? When did and where did you plan to do it? Did you actually do it? And were your needs satisfied? So how well did it work out for you? And so we're not really using these methods so much anymore. These were like two big experiments. And I think we could revisit them now because I think technology could really help us do this a little more easily without as much burden on the respondent. So if you would think about my own Google Calendar, I move stuff around all the time. So if there was just something on the back end that could preserve that process of me moving activities or deleting activities or saying maybe I'll do this, that might go a whole lot to help get us some of this information passively. So again, stuff that people are already doing, but we're not capturing it. This stuff on the bottom, where people aren't aware of this need, gets a lot more difficult then. So this is where we can get into a lot of speculation, but this is where if you really want to start thinking about predicting travel demand 20 years into the future, which is what our travel demand models often do, you really have to maybe get into these underlying behavioral factors, underlying behavioral motivations for travel in the first place. So how might we approach this stuff? Okay, so activities that aren't desired, but you can actually do them. So again, there's a lot of literature here from actually the health community, so around behavioral change. So Again, back to my dad not knowing how to ride the bus. So I'm not actually capturing that in terms of demand, but I'm helping him to realize that demand by making him aware through my poor dad is like my education guinea pig for a lot of things. So making people aware that this alternative exists, or making them aware that maybe what they're doing is not so efficient and there's a better way to do it. So you can provide them with information, show them how to use transit, show them what options are available, motivate them. So again, Fitbit, right, it's supposed to be telling you, get up and go take a walk. Or my fitness tracker will say, you only need another 300 more steps. Like, go walk around your kitchen till you get that done. So a little prompting, a little support. We talk about this a lot in Portland. It's, again, something that I observe in the engineering building as new students come in every year, maybe from other places. Maybe they're not so interested in cycling when they first arrive at PSU. But then we have this culture here that encourages them and maybe exposes them to cycling. And there's a lot of support, both positive support in terms of encouragement and negative support in terms of like, oh, you drove. So we could think about stuff in this quadrant of being activated in ways by actually prompting people to change and making them more aware of alternatives. Over here, though, this is, again, the sort of Jetsons, teleportation, stuff that we don't know that's coming down the pike. So how do we capture this stuff? Well, historically, the way we've done it in our travel surveys is to use stated preference surveys. So when an option isn't available yet, let's say high-speed rail or driverless vehicles, we can at least try to construct surveys that might help us to then understand how you might respond to that alternative if it existed. And some forms of these stated preference surveys actually don't identify the mode itself. It might just give you some characteristics, like how quickly you travel, or whether you're by yourself or with others, but doesn't necessarily anchor you to some physical form of mobility. So this is one way that we use to get at, how might people respond to things that don't exist yet, either don't exist in that region or don't exist in the world yet. But this has some limitations as well, because we, as the researcher, would have to conceive what those modes are, conceive what those alternatives are. So then we have to take another step back about what motivates us to travel in the first place. So what is it about being a human being and sort of our fundamental psyche that makes us want to get out and do the things that we do? So if you go back to Maslow, if you've taken a psychology course, he talks about the hierarchy of human needs, and that we have to start out meeting our basic physiological needs, right? So you got to eat, you got to sleep, you got to take care of yourself. And that these other needs are also important, and there's a very long discussion about if we need all of these or some of these, or if these are hierarchical in the way that he's described them. But basically getting at what are these underlying motivations? Will people want to engage in more recreation if teleportation, what will they do? If teleportation removes travel time, how will you spend your time? What will you do? Will you work more? Probably not. So how do we then decide what people will do with their time? Now, we don't have any answers to this, but with our current trajectory of relying on economics and engineering techniques, we'll never get at this without incorporating some of these other theories. Again, the marketing disciplines have really tapped into this, so getting at feelings of self-esteem or self-actualization. So if I buy those new shoes, won't I look good? Won't I? And so they have this way, or if you have that gym membership, you will use it. So they're tapping into this fundamental psyche and activating a need or creating a need in you. And so is there something here that we can draw upon in transportation forecasting methods? So I come up with this sort of inverted diagram. It's just another way to think about my four quadrants. But everything below here, so 1, 2, and 3, is, again, this stuff that we can capture in a more a typical revealed preference or engaging in people's awareness of what they want to do and capture this. So what did you plan to do? There's some filter here that has to do with constraints. And so one might even think about this as being some measure of latent demand. What didn't actually make it through these series of filters or constraints? This is what we actually did. This is what was scheduled to do. This is what we wanted to do. Above this line, though, how does something go from your psyche to being something that you want to do? And so these, again, aspirations, intentions, hopefully you can articulate those, or if we had the ability to ask people, what do you want out of life, or what is the lifestyle that you're looking for, that this might be capturable. But up here, dreams, desires, possibilities, unimagined activities, that gets harder and harder to get at. But we still do a very poor job of just these things, so tapping into this awareness. So I've just thrown a lot of theoretical stuff. I don't have an answer, but I'm hoping that it sort of makes you start to think and question the way that we're currently approaching evaluating demand and the way that we are currently collecting information about travel. Because I think that we need to have a more complete and theoretically sound way to think about travel demand and demand for activities. And I think that opening up this idea to multiple disciplines will only make this richer. Now, I don't think that we necessarily have to take all of this stuff and turn it into a quantitative predictive model, but understanding some of these things would help us understand trajectories. So if we are moving into an arena where mobility is becoming lower and lower cost or lower and lower burden on the traveler, how might we respond? How might we respond if we have changes in energy prices? What would the trajectories be, and how might we anticipate the behavioral response? So again, other people are doing this in other disciplines. We just don't capture this enough in what we do. So this is just symbolic that we're only getting this when we really need to be looking at what's under the surface. So I'm hoping that you guys have good questions or discussion and help me flesh this out, because I think it would be great to at least do some study to try to get up a notch of what was planned and what was unrealized. Thank you. I don't have a way to write down that you're asking this question, so you're going to have to write it down. But go ahead.
My question is, you mentioned that there is kind of predictable transportation or travel demands that's based on poverty or other circumstances for people. Currently, for example, when transportation design goes or cities based on actual demand, is there a factor of safety to include this kind of predictable?
Well, I would argue that if engineers are designing roads not at all for actual demand, they're designing it for what we've observed. But there might be much more demand that is suppressed in other ways. So, but in terms of factor of safety, I'm not sure I understand how that would be.
The space that they have for people to travel in a road, for example, regularly people count how many travels every day or based on a certain period of time. Then based on that, they improve it or keep it, or So what they are planning, how much space they will add in addition to include this.
Well, I'm not sure that they need to include additional space, because not all of that demand might be realized on the current transportation system. So it might want to be realized in other modes or other places. So I have to think about that some more, because I haven't really incorporated safety into this, although that's certainly a piece of Maslow's hierarchy, something that we want to satisfy in our travel sources, our travel modes. And if we don't feel safe, then we might suppress travel and activities. generalized.
I think I have a question. So, you mentioned that in the level 4, the quadrant 4, where there's demand that we don't know that we want to consume, and the transportation system hasn't met that unwanted demand. Do you think that current studies done, exploratory studies, when an MPO wants to explore launching a new transit system and they're trying to decide which mode to deploy, and they do all these surveys to ask the community, because it's part of federal requirements, if I'm not mistaken. Do you think like those kinds of studies can be informative on that quadrant, or should they be improved?
Yeah, I think that some of these stated preference techniques could be useful in sort of looking at demand that we're not aware of. But when I think about that fourth quadrant, I'm really thinking sort of about the way futurists think about our society, or science fiction writers think about our society. So we're not thinking about this in our daily life because it's just something that isn't here yet. So how might, I think it's easier to think about it sort of, like I said, retrospectively. Before we had light rail here in Portland, people weren't thinking about it, but how would we how would we capture or be able to evaluate that demand? But the way that MPOs are doing that now is they measure current demand, and they say, okay, we're adding a new mode, so that current demand is just going to get rearranged across the new modes or the new locations. We're not looking at actual new demand that might arise, and maybe demand that goes away because of these modes.
Even population growth, because now there's a shiny new light rail system in Portland.
Yeah, so you could have induced demand, like, depends on where you want to draw the system, but people moving here because they like to bike, for example.
For a lot of the induced demand on highway expansion, there's been lots of research. I think the normal heritable tweet is 2 years, 90% of your expansion is going to more congestion. And I'm just wondering how much of that is, how strong of a connection does that actually have to the researchers, these case studies that are out there, and how widely they're doing that?
So the current methods of looking at latent demand and induced demand due to highway improvements have a very narrow spatial scope. So basically they're often, they're measuring some elasticity with respect to demand and saying, okay, if the cost declines by this much, how much more will people consume? And then it becomes recursive, and then eventually the cost benefits go down because there's congestion. But the thing that isn't really analyzed very carefully in those studies is, where does that increased demand come from? So is it coming from other facilities? Is it coming from people who are already making that trip and using that facility, but now changing their travel time because it's easier or faster? Did they switch modes? So were they used to be on the bus, but now they're driving because it's faster? And so a lot of those studies are very narrowly scoped, and so they can't tell us where that demand comes from. They're just assuming some elasticity as if the demand were infinite. And so this is another sort of failing for not necessarily conceptualizing latent demand properly and taking maybe a system-wide approach.
So let's say 20 years down the line, we figure out a great way to capture all these different latent demands. What kind of ethical questions do we need to ask about how that information is used, right? Because you're essentially saying, I know what people want to do, and now I'm going to use that information to do or not do things in the infrastructure system. How is that handled now? And or is it? And what would knowing even more about what people want?
I think it raises a great question about privacy and then also just responsibility. So if people aren't necessarily able to articulate what their needs are, or they're not aware of what their needs are, then who are we as public agents to impose upon them or extract from them something that we think that they want? Again, marketers have this ethical responsibility presumably all the time in a capitalist system. You're not necessarily questioning the ads you see that say you should be drinking Coca-Cola or wearing Nikes and inducing that demand. But I think the question in terms of thinking about transportation planning, we just have to have some basis to make sound decisions and think into the future. So I think to the extent that this information is grounded in that goal or meets that goal, I think it's fine. But I think we have an ethical responsibility to think about unmet needs and unmet demand right now that we're not actually capturing. So, the stuff on the bottom, we may never really be able to incorporate those ideas, the things that we're not aware of. But the stuff on the top, where people are aware that they're not being able to make a trip, I think we have a responsibility to try to understand what those needs are and what the consequences are.
Earlier you said a travel diary. I think that's allows people to take their personal life and be observed. But how do you see it becoming a future tool?
How do I see travel diaries changing in the future?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know if they will, but I would like to see travel diaries ask more questions about, again, trips that weren't made. How satisfied were you with this trip? Did you have to change anything on your schedule because of this trip? How well did this meet your needs? So one of the issues that we have is in public agencies in collecting this data is that we're falling very far behind what the private sector has. So, they're collecting a lot of passive information using our smartphones, and we're often not reading that fine print and opting into that. But public agencies are very careful about ethics, and so they're very concerned about, collecting that kind of information and what kind of responsibility would be on the agency for having that. So we're still collecting this one-day travel diary, which we have a hard time getting people to fill out when we really need to have more days of data. And so I think the question is, how can the public agencies sit at the table with these private entities and sort of join forces to share information? But there's all kinds of issues surrounding that.
You brought up the older research that was done at McNally, about scheduling and planning. I remember that, and I'm glad you mentioned it because I did wonder what happened to it.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, it didn't go anywhere. But as you mentioned with technology, and this sort of relates to the last question, maybe we can get more of that information. And you gave the example of the Google Calendar you can things around. Let's take it a step further and imagine that we have some mechanism to capture even more of that.
Right.
Have you thought about what we would do with that?
Yeah, it's part of the problem with what the work that McNally did is, they have this great wealth of data, but then what do you do with it all? And so their motivation was really to get at modeling activity scheduling and sort of a precursor to our activity-based models. But I don't think that they were thinking about this as sort of catching the stuff that wasn't done. So I think they were really just trying to think about how far in advance people's planning horizon was. But I have been giving it a lot of thought about what would those measures be? Like, what would the measure on the negative end of the scale be? And it could simply be, depending on the time frame, how many trips were planned but were unmade. Like, how might we think about coming up with a model of immobility or suppressed demand? So at least having that measurement of what was on the calendar and didn't get done, and maybe having some ideas about why, would give us a wealth of information that we don't have now. So just as a start, I think.
I'm starting to think about getting beyond, how might this be useful beyond just maybe modeling?
Sure.
Because it does get at, and when you brought up Maslow, get to things like how satisfied am I? How happy am I Because if you're really frustrated, you can't get all those things done that
Right.
you want to get done, that's affecting your well-being in some ways, then it gets sort of bigger questions of how can we improve people's lives.
Yeah, I don't think the primary purpose of this is going to be to serve models per se, but I would really like to see the modeling community start questioning the fact that they're only looking at the positive end of the scale. So I think the biggest value is being able to say, okay, what wasn't done, and what was done. So do you have a sense of like what the priorities are? What took, when you look at the poverty literature and look at like decision making under constraint and sort of satisficing or making trade-offs, understanding what those hard decisions are. And so was it work that got done, or was work sacrificed for children's activities? So I think from a public policy standpoint, understanding some of those trade-offs at a minimum can help us define what the unmet need is and how it might not necessarily help us immediately to think about what those solutions are. But if you have some sort of poverty alleviation policy, we might want to know then how, using that kind of information, how it might activate this new demand or how it might meet this need. But this is another thing I don't think transportation planners are necessarily thinking about. We're just thinking about how we are going to respond to the transportation improvements and not necessarily thinking about how transportation demand is a function of all kinds of other things that maybe don't have so much to do with the transportation system.
I have a lot of thoughts, so I'll try to maybe give a couple comments. What about observing the same person moving to a new system where costs may change pretty drastically? So in terms of kind of getting at using more revealed behavior instead of stated, which is a little bit more dependable when you see someone behave differently than the same person, as a way to kind of understand trips they might not have made in place A, now are making in place B, or vice versa. My second comment is sometimes engineers look at like edge conditions as interesting cases. So if someone were infinitely wealthy, and we have very wealthy people for whom travel is zero cost, right? And so their only constraints will be time, and then they can have staff go out and do a lot of other trips for them. I wonder if you could look at some of that as kind of an ultimate, the edge condition in terms of zero cost travel. And if everyone were infinitely wealthy, they might behave similarly. As kind of seeing how many trips could possibly one fund or make if you had a large staff and helicopters to fly
If
around.
money were no object.
Right.
I mean, thinking about what the bound is, like, do we have infinite demand for activities? We're still bounded by 24 hours in a day. So if we didn't need to sleep, if we didn't need to travel, would we just action-pack, doing things all the time? Probably not. So how to get that limit? I'm much more interested in how all those staff get their stuff done if they're doing all that stuff for the person. I'm not so worried about. But I see what you're saying, that it could allow us to look at the maximum in some way. The mover thing, though, a lot of people have looked at, well, I wouldn't say a lot of people have looked at it, but it is a question people have attempted to look at. But the question with our current methods, you really can't know whether there's new demand, if it's the sort of existing demand that they have just now rearranged because travel costs are re-articulated, or if there's actually something new to offer. But it is another interesting way to use this framework to kind of think about responses, for sure. I also think about the scale, so the negative trip scale to the positive scale. I've mostly been thinking about how people are activating latent demand and moving it into realized demand, but there is the opposite effect where things that people are doing now move into that latent suppressed field as well. So again, this isn't something that's just about poverty, something we all experience, but I think it gets exacerbated and it's much easier to kind of wrap your head around when you start thinking about poverty as the motivator for suppressed demand.
about the poverty piece, in sort of thinking about starting to get at some of this information, do you think that those would be two different studies, like looking at people who are in poverty versus people who are not, or is there a way maybe to, can you collect that? Yeah, collect that data at the same time.
I don't know. So I have a proposal right now where I'm trying to take our current methods of collecting this information and look at these hard-to-reach populations that not only do we do a bad job of collecting the information from those that participate, we do a bad job of engaging them and getting them to participate in the first place. So where we would be using smartphones and giving it to them for a week and then going back and showing them what they've showed us, and this is saying that this is what we're interested in and this is what we've collected from you, how well does this actually reflect your travel experience? And is this what you would want decision makers to know about these trips? What else would you like people to know? And so I think if we start there, we can think about redesigning a survey that at least gets at, again, what's above the, what's on the awareness side of that chart. And then I think that would be useful across all populations. So I think if we start thinking about designing our transportation surveys with the least advantaged in mind, that will be much more all-encompassing. Other questions? Great. Well, I'll let you get out to the sunshine. So thanks for coming, and we'll see you next week. And if you asked a question, come see me, and we'll mark it off on the